New processor architectures bring with them a host of possible upgrades versus their predecessor. Faster clock frequencies in the CPU support Vizipia memory, improvements in the actual architecture to perhaps be more power efficient. If we're very lucky, we may even see an increase in the core count. This is particularly true in the mainstream, where obviously we were crying out for that in the dark days of 4 cores, 8 threads for quite some time. And then, well, perhaps the key metric that most of us are looking at for Zen 5 anyway is IPC, or instructions per clock. And with Zen 5 there has been, quite frankly, a dizzying number of IPC figures associated in terms of not only the rumours, but speculation online. In this video then, I want to talk to you guys about the, well, quite frankly, massive gulf in terms of IPC, somewhere in the 15% neighbourhood to 30 or 40% in some of the key metrics, and perhaps just give better context and just to try and make sense of all of this, as of course we are waiting for AMD's official announcement. Also want to sprinkle in a little bit of exclusive information that I have for Zen 5, but before we get too deep into the video, I want to ask you guys, what are you expecting for Zen 5 in terms of not only the clock frequency? Are we going to see perhaps a regression versus the predecessor? Are we going to see things being roughly in equilibrium? Or maybe we're going to be very lucky and actually see a clock frequency increase. And what about IPC? Single thread, multi-thread? Give your predictions down below and let's just see how things end up. It's going to be fun if nothing else. With all of that said, guys, let's just get right into it after this quick message from the sponsor of the video.
If you're running a copy of Windows 10 which isn't activated, of course, not only do you have to worry about the missing customization options, but there's also that annoying Windows desktop watermark reminding you to activate. Today's video is sponsored by WhoKeys.com, and they have an excellent price on Windows 10 Professional as well as Home keys. Yeah, and they also of course sell games. I've bought a few Windows 10 keys with my own personal account to test everything was legit and worked in preparation for this sponsored video. You can pick up one of their keys for 25% off using the coupon code RGT in the checkout. There's links to their website in the video description. Also, if you're building a few systems, there's bundles available too. Again, you can check out WhoKeys.com and use the coupon code RGT for 25% off the listed Windows 10 key prices.
Alright, before we get too technical, let's set some ground rules. This video is going to focus on the Granite Ridge lineup of CPUs, i.e. the desktop version of Zen 5. We will touch on Turin, the next generation of EPYC processors for server throughout the video, but the lens will largely remain on the mainstream AM5 platform because I think that's what most of my audience are going to be interested in. I also think that most of you are going to be familiar with the general specification rumours for Zen 5, particularly in its Ryzen incarnation. For those of you who need a quick refresh, I will have you covered with the very basics. You can see them on screen. AMD's top-end SKU boasts 16 cores with SMT2 support, 1MB of L2 cache per core, and a completely revamped architecture. AMD themselves have basically confirmed in official slides that it's a ground-up redesign. The IOD, or input-output die if you prefer, also carries over from Ryzen 7000, with likely some tweaks to have occurred to facilitate faster memory speed. This will be very critical for the desktop, as you'll, well, find out as we go through the video. If you currently own an AM5 motherboard, then great news. Granite Ridge sticks to the same platform, of course. A simple BIOS update is all you're going to need to upgrade an older board. Naturally, AMD will release a host of new boards, though in a manner mirroring what we've seen with AM4 in the past. So that's the easy stuff. Let's get on the discussion with IPC. As a brief recap, what I've stated in previous videos, well, IPC gains have been somewhere in the mid-teens to low 30% mark, perhaps more depending on specific applications. It's a big gap, to put it mildly. In fact, it's a gap so large that it could be confused with the Grand Canyon. It's actually pretty funny because many of the sources that have given me this conflicting information have very excellent track records, either regarding Zen or other leaks. Of course, I can't attribute specific stories to specific sources for obvious reasons, but this has been a really big source of frustration for myself. Now, it's not just my own information. There are other rumours such as Kepler L2 on Anantech's forums. Kepler has had also a pretty damn good track record from his own information, and from what he's heard, we're seeing an over 40% gain for server chips versus Genoa. Now, this is a server platform, and that is a key point. This will become more clearer as we go on, but basically my source also corroborates this, claiming a roughly 50% jump in spec int performance compared to Genoa. Now, both of these, the Turin and Genoa-based platforms, are rocking 96 cores. From my understanding, though, these frankly ridiculously impressive results are achieved thanks to a combination of IPC gains, but also higher clock speeds. Now, if Kepler and Mai, along with some others who have hinted similar things online, is accurate, and as always with this stuff, it's going to be interesting to see it is, spec int is of course an integer benchmark. Well, I bet you wouldn't have guessed that based on the name, huh? Anyway, it's essentially a rate benchmark. To put it really simply, it calculates the performance per core based on all of the threads and, well, cores available to it. Now again, from the numbers I've been given, just a little bit under 1.5 over Genoa, I think that my information is basically including both IPC and higher clock frequencies. His number, that is Kepler's, doesn't seem to include the extra clock frequency. Now his numbers are a little lower than mine, and I want you to, throughout the video, basically assume a roughly 40% gain. Now, you may think, well, that's just, you know, people on the internet. What about anything else? Well, while it's certainly not official confirmation, there is also something very interesting, and this actually stems from yet another spec in prediction. Now, I say prediction in such a way because legendary architect Jim Keller, who was actually a key member of AMD's CPU team when the first generation of Zen was being launched, and of course has, well, let's just say a couple of connections within the industry, he laid out performance projections of Zen 5 last year. Now, these projections were part of his work over at Tens Torrent, and it is again important to remember that this is not confirmed with AMD's marketing. But in Spec Int 2017, Keller projected 8.84 points for the server-based chips, or perhaps in a more meaningful way, some 30-ish% faster performance than what we have with Genoa. So there you have it, 30%, 40-ish%, with Spec Int anyway. But do you remember how just a moment ago I said that the server platform is a key point? Well, outside of the raise of TDP and high clock frequency, there is another big benefit with Turin, and that is overall I/O, and of particular note, the rumour is that Turin supports DDR5 6000 MTS. Now, assuming this is true, and after all, it may not be, it's not officially confirmed by AMD, that's a vast improvement over the current memory speeds of EPYC processors we have with Genoa, which is 4800 MTS. That's with an EPYC 9654 as an example. So, it's very possible that a good portion of the gains we're seeing isn't IPC exactly, but it's basically just extra bandwidth available courtesy of faster memory and better I/O. Now, all software, of course, does tax processors and I/O in a different way, but I certainly would not be surprised if some of these gains are simply, hey, you know what, I can actually read and write stuff to and from RAM faster. Yay! Now, we'll circle back to this soon because it brings up a very intriguing discussion regarding the bandwidth on desktop, but let's get into some other stuff regarding Zen 5. Zen 5 has increases in execution ability from 4 to 6 ALUs. Additionally, my sources are telling me that data loading and storage capability, LDST, are decently improved, along with a larger reorder buffer, ROB, I'm going to call it ROB just to make things simple for everyone. And I can't provide specific numbers, but one source told me that ROB is actually larger than Golden Cove's. There are other improvements too, such as better scheduling, and AMD have also confirmed a few things officially, such as front end getting an overhaul and as a wider issue. Again, some of this does confirm the rumours that have been floating around, and it of course is nice that AMD officially have confirmed at least a few pieces of info for Zen 5. So what does all of this mean? Well, a lot of stuff actually, but one thing is perhaps we're going to see better improvements with multi-threaded applications, basically just more efficient multitasking. Now, I've had a bit of mixed information regarding how well SMT scales for Zen 5, but either way, it's hard to deny that SMT will help leverage the extra stuff, quote unquote, on a core. Actually, while we're on the subject of that 6th ALU, I've had a source that hints that maybe we could see it slightly underutilized due to some limitations in the hardware. scheduler, Rob, dispatch, and maybe some other bits and bobs as well. Now remember, this is based on early engineering samples, and also it is a rumour, and this could mean that things can change by launch. In fact, and things can certainly change by launch. Indeed, I'd not be surprised if it did. Either from faults in the current engineering hardware itself, improvements to microcode that we can see. Honestly, it's just going to be very interesting to see what happens with final hardware, software optimizations, to see the real true potential of the improvements of Zen 5. But even if it doesn't improve, not all of the execution units or other resources on the silicon being totally utilized on a CPU, either from AMD or Intel or other vendors, isn't exactly uncommon in CPU design. And of course, Zen 6 is probably going to continue to evolve and improve this, and Zen 7 and so on. Now, Moore's Law is Dead has also leaked some slides which show a 15% IPC gain. I do want to tell you guys, from my understanding, these are legitimate slides, and I do believe that they are true. But do notice that there is a plus sign next to the percentage sign. Now, what does that mean? Well, perhaps it could mean that maybe this is the minimum for expected gains. Remember, AMD has, well, let's just say they have a habit of slightly sandbagging. Indeed, the original Zen 1 design was touted officially by slides released to the public to be a 40% improvement over its older CPU designs in August of 2016. Fast forward several months, in February of next year, just as we were getting ready to see the processor's launch, which if memory serves was March, AMD actually stated that they beat the goal. Lisa Su took to stage and said, hey, you know what, with Zen 1, we achieved a 52% improvement. Now, obviously, that's a pretty big gap, but I want to be very clear here, guys. I am not suggesting AMD is intentionally understating performance. I guess it's technically possible that they have put out some slides or stuff like that to throw off competitors, but I think it's much more likely that information in projections certainly could change on final hardware and software. Now again, this may not be true. These slides, again, are legitimate. However, it's also possible that they were just being very conservative with the information. Now, also, this brings us to another interesting point, and that is, do you remember that interesting tidbit regarding desktop memory bandwidth? A source told me that there is a very significant increase in the bandwidth demand compared to the previous generation, and this could certainly lead to a bigger gap in performance between desktop and server versions of Zen 5. Now, this is a really big change for Zen 6. Zen 6, from basically its inception, to my understanding, and I'm talking about the desktop iteration here, it was always being designed around some really big changes in IOD. I've spoken somewhat about them in the past, but basically speaking, the entire IOD design, plus a lot of other stuff on the actual packaging of the processor, is really changed. Basically, there's going to be, let's use the word parity, between the desktop and laptop designs, and I think that that could be a really good thing going forward. It's going to really very much help the bandwidth constraints of Zen 6, and I think Zen 6 is also going to be on AM5 as well, but I've had one source still tell me that that's not the case, but now two people are telling me that it is actually on Zen 5. Anyway, with all of this taken into account, I want to try and wrap this up somewhat, and frankly there are a lot of possibilities for IPC. And this is assuming that the numbers that appear online are true. Now, let's be honest, fakes can happen, and it's very difficult to know exactly what is and what isn't fake sometimes, because AMD and any company actually have a habit of releasing information or perhaps a plan that was originally intended. I mean, I've used this example tons of times before, but look at NVIDIA with all of the changes to the stuff with the configuration of the RTX 4090 and so on. Basically, they can plan one thing, or perhaps it doesn't quite go to plan. Stuff can get held back from one generation to another, and so forth. With that said, I think that there are some possibilities that we're seeing these different numbers. Conditional gains is one of them. The higher IPC numbers could be true, but only in very specific scenarios, i.e. in one or two applications here or there, yes, it has a really big gain, but as an overall, no, it doesn't. There's also the server and desktop problem. Server CPUs like Turing simply could have just more room to stretch its legs because it's got more bandwidth plus other bits and bobs. And additionally, if it is bandwidth constrained, you could also say that that's not really IPC in the same way of saying a core architecture. It's just that a bottleneck, in this case I/O, has been somewhat resolved. There's also single and multi-thread. Now this is another way of saying the way that benchmarks can happen, but perhaps single thread doesn't perhaps scale as well as multi-thread or vice versa, or perhaps it depends on the number of cores being loaded, particularly on the desktop. Also, what about the benchmark itself? Because some applications could just score really well because of AVX 512. It does seem to be that AVX 512 performance has essentially doubled. I'm sure in the real world that isn't quite the number that we see. It may be, let's say, 70, 80, 90%. Let's say 80% for the sake of this. But not all applications are going to leverage that, especially some games. However, with that said, if you're someone who's keenly emulating PS3 games, then by golly, you're going to be having a good time. It's also possible that AMD have released gimped ES or underplayed the slides, as I said earlier, but again, I'm certainly not saying that is definitely the case. It's a possibility, but anything is a possibility. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, my own sources and opinions online are very divided. Some state that the performance is 30% across a multitude of different benchmarks. Others say that it's more scenario dependent. Others say that it's, well, never more than around 15%. That was always the plan. The general consensus is Zen 5 is going to be impressive. The question is just how impressive. Now, there have also been some benchmarks which have popped up online, such as one that I covered a day or two ago. And this is a Strix Point variant. It's a 4/8 core, and the results seem decent-ish. It's roughly on par with the 7700X, but that has just 8 cores. The problem is, many of these benchmarks don't really help us too much because we don't know the exact configuration. Does it even have fast memory? What even is it running? Is it running dual channel memory? For all we know, it's got like, it's running EDO memory, and yes, I am of course joking, but we don't know the configuration even of the TDP. We don't know if there's bugs in the silicon. Are there problems with it? How far is it boosting? I mean, let's just be honest, the desktop CPU, the 7700X, can go over 100 watts, 105 if you want me to split hairs. But what about this? Is it 45 watts? Is it somewhere in the 30s? Are they doing tests where it's even lower? No one knows. With this all said, my personal expectations are mid-teens to maybe 20%. Why? Because there is so much conflicting information. Personally speaking, I think it's better to look at things conservatively. Therefore, if you're expecting, let's say 15%, and you end up getting, let's say 23%, and no, that's not a leak, I'm just using an example, then that's just awesome, right? That's just good. What about clock frequencies? Well, again, this is where things get a little muddy. Now, I have been told of a couple of engineering samples that are floating around. These are not EPIC processors, but these are, well, basically CPUs that will end up becoming Ryzen. One of them is hitting 5.5 gigahertz in some workloads. However, there seems to be, let's say, issues with this. This seems to be a mixture of microcode problems and a Gisa weirdness, plus just some bugs in the actual silicon itself. If this is true, it's probably a regression versus Ryzen 7000, of course powered by Zen 4. My other sources though insist that yes, this is old silicon, but AMD have since done a respin, and things have improved quite considerably. I was actually given a figure of 6.1 gigahertz, however, while this figure has been backed up by a couple of sources, I don't know if this is Fmax. One person is telling me it is not Fmax, and the other person is basically saying they think it probably is, but they're not 100%. Now, if it is Fmax, it would mean there's an improvement over Raphael, but personally speaking, I don't think that this is a figure that's going to be like well, I just don't think this is going to be a figure that you're going to see when the CPU is going full cowabunga and all cores blazing. I'm not expecting like a 6.1 gigahertz, 16 core, 32 thread processor running AVX 512. Obviously, again, it would be great if it is, but I think this is probably an F-max figure. Honestly, it will be absolutely fascinating to see how Zen 5 ends up performing in not only server environments, but of course the mainstream as well, across a myriad of different benchmarks, both in single and multi-thread, testing out different memory speeds and timings, and it will be also very curious to see how the X3D processors are shaping up. With Zen 3 to 4, roughly speaking, you could pretty much make a good prediction from Zen 3 to Zen 4, but it'll be also very interesting to see what happens with Zen 5 X3D. Obviously, if you add in the V-cache, it's going to benefit some applications pretty predictably. However, it'll be interesting to see how much of a benefit it makes in bandwidth-starved applications, because while obviously the X3D is very helpful, it's also not the same thing as, let's say, having quad channel memory support, if you excuse me. But with that said, here's an interesting question as well I want to propose to you guys. Are you going to upgrade to Zen 5? Let's hypothetically say that it's a roughly 30% improvement. Now, again, I'm personally being more conservative with my estimates, but let's just assume, for the sake of this video, that an 8-core or a 16-core or whatever you're interested in, roughly speaking, is 30% faster than the predecessor. Would you upgrade? Now, obviously, with a question like that, one of the big ones is, do you have the money? But the other one is, what platform do you currently have? I've actually asked this question to a number of my friends who are interested in PC gaming, and curiously they said that even if it's 40% faster, they're probably not going to upgrade. And these are folks who have a decent PC at the moment. Now the reason is, let's assume that you have a 4090, or maybe you go to like, you know, a high-end RDNA 5 GPU eventually, or an RTX 50 or whatever. Yeah, sure. If you do buy a faster CPU, minimum frame rates will go up, as we all know, but would it be enough of a benefit if you have, let's say, you know, a 7800 X3D or like a 12900K? Arguably, it'll be interesting. I think Zen 5 is going to be particularly cool for those who have kind of been stuck on an older platform for quite some time. Maybe if you've got like an older AM4 board, especially if you've not got an X3D chip, and, you know, I'll be very interested to see how Zen 5 does, because while I even have some people who have told me, yup, I definitely want to upgrade, some are even saying they're just not interested in the vanilla chips, because quite frankly, they already have an X3D. And it's kind of like, you know, it's one of those things where if you're going to upgrade and you've got the flagship of a particular range of product, it's very difficult mentally to then upgrade. This is one of the big problems, of course, with the GPU market, which is an entirely separate discussion. But it's like, let's just say back in the day, this is just a quick tangent, but back in the day, it's like, you know, you would pay, what, $800 for a flagship, depending. And now it's like, well, you know what, $800 is going to get you like a mid-range card. Which, again, it's like if you're used to paying like 800 or like, you know, $1,000 or something like that, and that's like your mental limit, because again, it's like if you're paying like $2,000 for a GPU, that's a lot of money. Like, that is an insane amount of money. By the way, if you see me glancing over occasionally, there's just a fly that happened to fly through the tiny little crack in the door, and it's like driving me a little bit insane. So that's helping my filming. Anyway, guys, I think that's just about it for this particular video. Take care of yourselves. Have an amazing day. Bye for now.